his name is one which we all grew up with. His interest in landscape, but also in education and science, which to us, as we will talk about today, underlies landscape, is a true inspiration. But before we begin to get into some of the substance that we're going to be talking about on Bangalore, I'd like to make a distinction between two landscapes, both of which to some extent we work with, and both of which to some extent you're all probably familiar with. It's landscape, on the one hand, as the last act of settlement, and landscape, on the other hand, as the first act of settlement. Now, to just clarify what we mean by the last act of settlement, this is the landscape that we're all probably more familiar with. It's a landscape that is generally associated with embellishment. It's a landscape of gardens, the landscape of parks, the landscape of avenues, trees, and to some extent, in Bangalore particularly, lakes. Now, these are, at least coming across today to the general public, at least in a growing movement, as an ecology of amelioration. And by amelioration, I mean that there are these activist projects today that work to save Bangalore's lakes, save Bangalore's trees, save Bangalore's parks. These are objects that are already defined in the landscape. To a large extent, unfortunately, this landscape is categorized also as a luxury. It is the landscape that falls off the table when money goes dry, when problems arise, when society is in a development mode. So in a nutshell, the landscape that is a last act of settlement is landscape that is in a dichotomized world, a world of environment versus development, a world of luxury versus necessity, a world of beauty versus function and utility. Now you may argue that there are ways to bridge this, and people are bridging it, but the language is distinct. You have to deal with this dichotomy in order to overcome it in some way. Now I would like to draw your attention to the other landscape, which is, I think, at least in our work, more interesting and much richer, and that is the landscape as a first act of settlement. Now, what do we mean by landscape as a first act of settlement? It is the act of individuation, the act of separation, separating, for example, water from land, urban from rural. These are lines that you draw in the land when you settle. It's the landscape by which you actually familiarize yourself with the land in order to inhabit, in order to live. It is an act, to a large extent, of constructing ground. It's fundamental. Now, one would think that this happens only once, or twice, perhaps. But I think it happens much more often. Of course, most seminally, you see it in acts of colonization. When colonizers come and make the land their own, they give it a language that then the native, as it were, lives with. But it happens other places too. I think it happens in moments of invention and innovation, when settlement perhaps is more difficult than easy. So it's something that we are curious about, both as landscape architects and as teachers, because this is a moment that we find very rich. It's a moment that's filled with angst and anguish, but it's a moment that provides for the longue durée of settlement. We would go further to suggest that the Bangalore landscape has gone through a number of such acts of settlement, of people coming in and setting up a language. But the most profound one, I think, and the one that we all live by to a large extent, is the language that was set up in the 1790s, 1800s, It was the language of surveyors, the language of traversers that came in with the British Army. And much of what they laid out in the land, much of their vocabulary, much of the language of landscape that they settled by is the language of today's administration, education, and in fact, everyday conversation. And that, to a large extent, will be the subject of today's our presentation today. But one thing I want to make clear, because I think it is rather clear, the context of this landscape, that is the first act of settlement, is a landscape that is flux. It's a dynamic landscape that is constantly in movement. You've got to find some way of settling it before we settle, as it were. In terms of, in Ivan Illich's terms, as he has appropriated Gaston Bachelard, he describes this landscape, of course without calling it as such, as dark matters that exist before space was. So to some extent, you would say that this is the stuff that confronts the explorer, the pioneer, who inhabits the frontier and who is forced to make sense in order to survive and live. So we, just to end this brief introduction, we wear two hats. One is the hat of a designer, architects and landscape architects, where we are pushed to, in some sense, represent this landscape that is the first act of settlement, because we find it rich in providing the space, as Bachelard says, the space that follows from the dark matters, or perhaps another category that that one invents in order to construct form. The other hat we wear is one of teacher, one of researcher, one of explorer, where we travel landscapes and actually try to engage it on this ground of the first act of settlement. And here we are forced, actually, to some extent, to begin by merely wandering and then in some ways drawing out and discerning distinctions that are perhaps very familiar to everybody else, but the terms that we find ourselves with provides for future interventions that sort of gradually open up on terms that we are at least first not familiar with. So we don't start with a hypothesis or anything like that. It is really something that unfolds. So today, we want to speak about this landscape that surrounds us. I think I'll let Anu introduce the...
If you have the lights down. Thank you. We're going to digress briefly, and I'm just going to take you through a couple of issues that confronted us in our work on the Mississippi. And I'm doing that partly because the Mississippi, the way it was represented, the way it's been constructed, makes clear certain issues which are very buried in, ambiguous in this landscape of Bangalore and the Deccan. And it just clarifies the issue about how we see landscape, how we actually represent it, how it's drawn in a map, has a profound impact on how it's constructed. So maps and drawings are not only recordings of what is reality, it actually constructs the world around us. It projects it in other ways. As Dilip said, that we all take for granted this demarcated landscape, the boundaries, the kind of enclosures we inherit. And as designers and teachers, we feel it is important once in a while to pause or to allow for this actually other measures of some of these dynamic landscape to emerge in our work. And even though it may be impossible in our day-to-day life that we have to accept enclosure, we have to accept boundaries, we have to accept categories, but we have to also allow ourselves that moment to actually uncover. So this image that you see on the screen right now is a place which is called Land's End. And it is really the mouth of the Mississippi. And looking at it, it's an image taken in the 1970 floods. It's very difficult to say which side is land and which is water and whether it's even separable. Next. And so for us, actually, the design on the Mississippi starts really with this first act of demarcating what is land and what is water. And in this very early map, the term terra incognita less than really emphasizing unknown territory, is really about territory which is ready to be known. It's sort of waiting to be categorized and marked and engaged. And so the design of the Mississippi in some ways again begins with singling that line out. This is the map of the American subcontinent. Excuse me, Dilip, can you go back to that? Yeah. And it's really signaling that one line out of many possible lines. And it's really an act of actually identifying what may have been many possible courses.
Sorry, skipping.
And that line sometimes becomes, objectified, disembodied enough to be disengaged from the land surrounding it. And after this, the famous flood of 1927, it was envisioned as many lines which defined a basin, but was still about a line which is separate from the territory around it. And I'd like to just briefly take you 500 miles from that mouth which I started you off with, because there exists this amazing model of the Mississippi, which is probably the most concrete and literally concrete realization of this dichotomy and this separation. It was built on a site which is of almost 200 acres, and it's 40 acres of cast concrete that was poured here. And even though the model is crumbling and is sort of abandoned today, its measures are still very much part of this landscape. And it was built, it was initiated actually in the 1940s by German POWs, and it was used to actually predict flood, but also as a public relations tool for engineering constructions. Just in terms of the scale, it's a mile on it is one step. And, it's exaggerated in its vertical dimension, that about 100 feet is 1 foot on the model. But time is also modeled here. It's 5.4 minutes is 1 day. But what's really fascinating is that this really gave a particular representation of what the Mississippi was. Next. And it really was about cubic yards of flow, and this was really the image with which we still live with. And even though the model has been abandoned, we find that in the landscape out there, this, the representation of it is still at work. It's still constructing the scene. It's still constructing the landscape. Today, these two lines which define these boundaries have become levees, which started with just about 3 feet high, and they are 40 feet and rising, and they line almost 2,000 miles along, on either side of the Mississippi. What you see as the image below are called revetments. They're less visible than levees. They're actually concrete mats, which actually line every bend, every meander, to in some ways keep it in place, not let it move. So in some ways, that objectification, that singling out of this entity is very much at play in this landscape. And, this is dredges which are sort of taking out every living material from the center of midstream. It's as much for navigation, but it's also to sort of keep it as this continental drain. And, these are in many ways great feats of design. Their language has gone all over the world. They've been emulated in the Amazon, in the Ganges, in Bangladesh. Engineers have gone all over. And it's really in the moment of flood that one actually sees this anarchy, this sort of wild spirit of the Mississippi, which actually demands a different kind of negotiation and less about control. But what's very interesting, and we were actually there in America during the 1993 flood, is that it erases for a moment only, territories, places, boundaries. And just for that brief moment, if one can sort of put aside the tragedy of the event, one acknowledges a terra incognita, one has time to reconsider. But of course, as things are in a country like the States, it really becomes, let's raise the levees. And it's more about floodware and more knowledge. But we find it also momentarily erases maps, erases the geographies that we have inherited. And for a while, you suddenly start to see this amorphous landscape and are able to reconsider how one should actually look at. So is it really a question of reinforcing the line, or are there other measures that actually emerge from this landscape? Next. And so coming back to terra incognita as a way of just always being able to find that condition in which we can reinvent, I would like to quickly take us, so that we don't spend more than the time allocated to us, to a landscape which is very much closer to us, and which, rather than being almost terra incognita, was actually invisible to the cartographers of the 2nd century. And this is a map by a Greek cartographer called Ptolemy. And if you can even, you can see India Entrum Gangeum there. the Indian peninsula actually doesn't even exist. It's sort of really a map from the point of view of land. And even though sailors later on were acutely aware of the peninsula, the subject of this conversation today, or the focus of our work, which is the lower Deccan, is really missing here. I mean, it's the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats, and there was no sort of sense of knowledge that there was a whole territory within. And it was actually much later, when the missionaries actually started to come into this land, that there was a sense of what they started to call as the interior that existed. And we find that it was as late as almost the 17th century, and this is a French map by a cartographer called Bellin, that the name Bengaluru, which you probably can't see at the resolution of these images, is a little red speck in the middle, appears really as a point on the map. And we found that maps around this period, it appears, it disappears, it appears, it disappears. And of course, this point today for us is this entity, this garden city that we have inherited and we live in. And it really took a different kind of individual and other circumstances globally as well as locally to actually reveal and give us this language of landscape, which Dilip mentioned, that we actually are very much part of our vocabulary today.
These particular men that quite fascinated us at this particular time, which is about the 1790s, 1810s, were amateurs. They inhabited a moment in history that we often refer to as the Enlightenment. Eurocentric. It was also a time of Eurocentric discovery, wherein you had Captain Cook, you had Joseph Banks, etc., traveling lands, collecting material, extending, trying to define what botany was about, trying to define what geology was about. They were naturalists in some sense before the language of botany, geology, zoology, etc., developed. It was also a time of societies, of royal societies, that were sort of forming a center that was parallel to the university education system. And it was a vast network across the globe of these individuals who were aspiring as much to scientific to feats of scientific knowledge as they were to actually sort of colonizing any particular land. They followed in the footsteps of the conquerors. And here, the men that we, to some extent, tracked, were following in the footsteps of Lord Cornwallis in the Third Mysore War of 1791. Here you see, Cornwallis took this decision in February of 1791 to go into the interior, because that's what the Deccan was. No one dared, in some sense, climb the Eastern Ghats. It was a barrier. And interestingly, the word Ghat does not necessarily mean the mountain range that the Western and the Eastern Ghats. At that particular time, it meant as much. It meant passes. It meant passes into another territory. But nobody dared enter the interior only because of fear of the unknown. To a large extent, it was a terra incognita, in the words of a number of men, particularly Colin Mackenzie. He says the Deccan was an interior, except for for a few missionaries who had come out with information. It was not a known place. So when Cornwallis dared to enter with 40,000 men, and these men traveled with their families, and adventurers, people who went into plunder, they had 40,000 bullocks. You can imagine, it was a nation. It was a whole nation on the move, and they had food to survive for 14 days. And this you see in one of the route surveyor's drawings, entering the passes through Chittoor. It was called the Mugli Pass, as you can see there, coming through the passes and then reaching Palmaner, and then from there heading to Bangalore. They reached Bangalore in about 2 weeks, actually. So they were already at the end of their supplies. They're coming down on Old Madras Road, and they have the first skirmish with Tipu's troops, because Tipu had been informed that Cornwallis was coming from the southern passes, the southeastern, at least from this direction. But that was merely a feint, and Cornwallis came in from a more northerly northerly pass, and headed to Bangalore. But both the armies approached, one on Airport Road today and the other on the old Madras Road, and they were fighting across C.V. Ramanagar, initial skirmishes. But to some extent, they did not want to be delayed, and they headed through the brown hedge. There was a hedge that went around Bangalore, 6 kilometers in radius, and it was a common feature in most of the settlements south of Bellary. It was a planting of prickly pear and acacias and such thorny plants, and the army settled on Alsur Tank. And all this happened, except for this skirmish, there was no fighting at all. But they were at the end of their supplies. So the first thing that Cornwallis, this is a map done by surveyors of the bound hedge. But if you notice, it is also a battle map for Bangalore, with the movement of artillery positions that you can see distributed fighting on different days at different points within the bound hedge. So this bound hedge was as much a battleground as it was the first settlement, as it were, of the army of Lord Cornwallis. And Cornwallis ultimately, the next day on March 6th of 1791, settled where the cantonment station is. In this part, I guess, to the east of this institute. And Tipu's men were here on the southeast. And as you will see, southwest. And as you will see, as sort of time passes, this became the cantonment, and that became the city. But this is the Bangalore Peta, as they called it. Peta meaning town with an adjoining fort. Some people say Pete, but this is the way the surveyors refer to it, as Peta. And this is the stone fort that to the south. It had a mud wall. The fort had a ditch, and at least the town had a ditch and a mud wall around it, and the fort had a stone moat. So basically, surveyors decided to penetrate the Peta first. This wasn't a time of, in India particularly, of armies fighting in the open plains, as they were still doing in Europe, as Waterloo was fought, for example. It wasn't fought in a town. But here, they stormed the town, and in fact found a very wealthy town where people had all fled, of course. But they say it was one of the richest towns in India. Not that they knew all of India at that time, but from what they had seen, a number of surveyors made a note of this. But on March 21st, they breached the fort with artillery that they had positioned here. This map, interestingly, is a map of battle. It was an event more than a space. So they were not so much concentrating on the space of the Peta. They were mapping the event of the war, and you can see the troop movements and the fighting, the artillery fires. What happened at this point in time, now that they had their provisions, Cornwallis decided to attack. The whole plan was to actually move on to Srirangapatnam, which they call Seringapatam. And Seringapatam is over here. But unfortunately, he could not go through a whole belt that is Savandurg, Ramgiri, forested jungle, and filled with what they call drugs, which are these fortified mountains like Savandurg itself. But there were a whole lot of them here, and the army could not penetrate. So Cornwallis was forced to center his strategy on Bangalore, in Bangalore. Make Bangalore a base camp. And he camped there for a year. And this was by chance. Bangalore, as Anu said, was a point in a map. In fact, there were many maps at the time that actually showed, other places like Magadi, Chikbalapur, which was Chinnabalaram, Kolar, as larger entities, more prominent entities. So Bangalore, almost by accident, became a place and a campground that was settled for a period of a year. And from here, Cornwallis made movements to capture various chieftains of various drugs in this landscape. But this map, drawn by Robert Colebrook in 1792, after the war, actually shows the singling out of elements along the routes. This was the spine of later maps. But here, you see the positions of troops, but you also see the singling out of tanks, trees, hills, points, things that become then the language of today's maps. This is actually a drawing of the war itself and how they conquer these various drugs in various directions from Bangalore, centering Bangalore on the tableland. But every time they came home, at a time like this, at a time like this, at a time like that, they always referred to Bangalore as home. It was coming home. This is how they drew out the landscape. They began to draw. Did you see tanks? I mean, these are movements from Bangalore in various directions. These are called route surveys. As the army moved, these men who traveled with them actually drew. But these men were not just drawing the land. They did not follow the army alone. They were also ahead of the army. They were leading the army. They were finding the campground. They were reading the land. They were searching for higher ground to camp, lower ground to allow water to pass, etc. So they were, I mean, in the hedge map that you saw earlier, that was the first map actually of the tanks of Bangalore. And you see over there not a finite, boundary, but you see a whole demarcation of wetland and water movement. I forgot to mention that when the map was up, but perhaps we can come back again. They also drew a landscape like this. They drew horizons. Something that perhaps everybody looked at unconsciously or saw unconsciously, but what they did was actually draw it out. And this is actually the surveyor, Alexander Beetson, positioned actually in Devanahalli, drawing, Nandidrug and the various horizons around. They were in some way objectifying the landscape, making it visible to some extent, in order to communicate to later surveyors that this was the point they were at. So in some sense, they were also saying these are permanent markers in the landscape. This is a drawing of Savandurg before it was attacked in December of 1791. But you can see the lines and bearings that surveyors viewed these objects by in order to frame and frame an attack. Once Bangalore was this was in what I'm talking about now is 1792. We then move into 1799 when the final war against Tipu Sultan was fought. Bangalore did not feature at all. It was Srirangapatnam that was the center of that brief war, and it was brief apparently because surveyors now knew the land and they could take the army directly to Srirangapatnam by another route. So they eventually, when they took the tableland, what emerged after that was a continuing of the route surveyors' activity of mapping the ground. But now they're drawing boundaries. Interestingly enough, Bangalore, which was at the center of the hedge, a settlement at the center of the hedge, the name Bangalore was given to the hedge, to the area of the hedge itself. So it was called the Kasbah of Bangalore. And the district was actually demarcated, and it was called the Pargana of Bangalore. So in some sense, they took the name Bangalore and elevated it above all other settlements, centering it even more on the peninsula and on the Mysore tableland. Over here, you see a drawing in 1832, actually, and you can see how the information is gathering. You begin to see a filling out of tanks, of settlements. Instructions going out to surveyors at that time is, these villages move. Villages change their names. Fix them. Don't let them change their names. Don't let people move as freely as this thing. And they saw it as a kind of rascality, obviously, of avoiding revenue. And so, as part of a larger taxation system, et cetera, we find property lines, lines that are drawn with the clarity, of a marker on the land, something that was relatively new. I'm sure that before that, people just pointed to that village and said, it's my territory, that's this, But now it has become a much more fine-grained, fine-tuned seeing, as it were. Here you see the drawing of the tableland today, in 1830s, that is now featured in atlases. What actually was at one time centered on Bangalore, in a sort of relative sort of centering place, is now centered in some ways on the surface of the earth, on latitudes and longitudes. Bangalore is here. You can see the hedge is still surviving at this particular time. Interestingly, we sort of traced this hedge, wondering where it was, superimposing it on maps. It is, where all the toll booths into the city are located. So today, if you want to know where the hedge was, you're on the Margidi Road, on the Bellary Road, on the Old Madras Road. You find the toll booth. That's where the hedge That's where the hedge crossed. In fact, it's right outside the Indian Institute of Science, and the other side is the toll booth to enter from the on the Bombay highway. So, but to come back, I mean, as much as they were extending out into the landscape and drawing this extended landscape, they were also drawing the features of settlement. And what we found interesting here is that they drew a settlement with a walled, they drew a walled entity. And they drew 4 roads. I mean, this is probably one of the earliest sketches of the town of Bangalore. Interestingly enough, when historians actually look back to the founding, as it were, of this town, they suggest that it was Kempegowda I who laid out the town. But the image that they draw attention to is the image of is this image that the surveyors drew for the first time in 1791. 300 years after Kempegowda. I think Kempegowda is 1537. He laid out the town. So this, it was like as if this town remained just as it was, this thing for 300 years. But we looked into this. I mean, these surveyors also uncovered an interesting myth that, from what I've heard, is associated with a number of settlements in South India, where apparently Kempegowda actually designed not a town, he designed an event. He put 4 bullocks in the middle at the crossing of Avenue Road, and at this crossing here, apparently, at a place where he dreamt of a hare chasing a dog, which again I believe is a common myth associated with a number of settlements. But at this place, he pointed 4 bullocks in 4 directions and allowed them to plow, to furrow the streets of what he saw as a future town. In that, with that sort of occasion, actually, the walls become merely contingent points, perhaps where the bullocks got tired, I don't know. But the thing is that this becomes a place of emergence. Bangalore becomes a place of emergence. It's the roads that are probably not, that begin at certain points and continue to move forward. It's very different from looking at this place, at this Avenue Road Chickpet crossing, as a chowk, as an intersection of traffic. It's a completely different perception of an urban situation. Of course, you can extend further. Bangalore continues to emerge and extends across a terrain, from this particular point in all the directions around, as if sort of constructing a topography of the city. Now, this is to return for a moment to this land within the bound hedge. In 1807, and we found this by almost sheer accident, actually, John Blackiston was asked to design a cantonment to centralize the troops of the European regiments in Bangalore. There was a lot of debate. I know people say that Bangalore was chosen for its salubrious climate. It's a little more complex than that. There were a number of other competitors, towns on the tableland, and Bangalore was chosen for its centrality, as much as strategic center on the tableland, as much as for its climate. Because the soldiers, when they came here and settled in 1792, brought plants with them. They brought turnips, they brought cabbages, they brought European vegetables. And while they were fighting a war, they were also planting these vegetables and found that the soil was good over here. So that was another plus point for Bangalore. So when Blackiston was asked to design a cantonment, he chose the place where Cornwallis first settled when he came across the bound hedge from Madras. And this is one of the earliest maps of 1832 showing the first grains of settlement. Interestingly, the land that he chose and Cornwallis chose before him was actually on the east of Bangalore, where the land levels out. It's a gently undulating terrain. Just before it reaches the Arkavati, crosses over into the Arkavati basin, which then flows into the Kaveri, which is this ridge line that runs across. But the land becomes much more one of ravines and steep drops. So the flat land chosen here, as you can see in the section here, you can see the difference in the 2 territories. This became the city, that became the cantonment. What Blackiston did was actually, when he designed the cantonment, interestingly saw it as a longer lasting camp. He did not see it as a town and a city. He says it, this thing that to some extent, this was a land that was still in movement. It wasn't quite sort of occupied by the British. It was still in the hands of the Raja. It is given back to the Vodea family. But to some extent, the British had their positions already marked out. But Blackiston, when he set out his town, he set it out around the esplanade. And the esplanade was a condition of all army camps. When they camped, it was where the bazaars were laid out every evening for the troops. I mean, and this is what I say, it was a nation on the move. Any army moved like a nation. They actually set out the shopping, as it were, every evening of their period of war. So he found the esplanade to be a necessity of the cantonment, and that is what, it was really a land of, a place for a sort of exemplar of the Mysore tableland, and became the center of the cantonment. But here you see the two twins, the twins of Peta and cantonment developing as two nodes of the Bangalore, of the place within the Bangalore hedge. But interestingly enough, none of the other settlements, and there were a number of other settlements around, Alsur, Adagodi, places like that sort of to some extent were reduced to villages. And even though many of them predated Kempegowda, you have the Chokanatha temple in Domlur, which is hardly spoken about as a settlement. But like I say, this is one act of settlement which we live with, one act of writing history which we live with today. That map was 1877. This map is 1897 of this thing showing actually the growth of the nodes, as it were, and the coming together really of the larger terrain of Bangalore. But the circles that you see here have nothing to do with the hedge anymore. The hedge is long gone. But what these circles indicate at the distance from the residency, because this is now the center of Bangalore. Now I want to take you down to another traverse. We call these traverses these acts of landscape invention, as it were, and we have identified 4. This is the second. That was route surveying. The second one is triangulating. Like I said, this was the time of the Enlightenment and a search for scientific fact. One of the unknowns at the time was the curvature of the Earth. And in 1735, it was decided that we've got to know the curvature of the Earth, and you have to know it only empirically. Because since Newton, it was known that the Earth was not a sphere, not a perfect sphere, that it was in some ways, modified, but they didn't know whether it was an oblate spheroid or a prolate spheroid, flat at the poles or flat at the equator. They did not quite know. So they decided to find out. And the French Academy of Science sent a troop out to Quito, at that time it was Peru, today it is Ecuador, to actually measure the curvature of the Earth at the equator. They sent another team to Lapland, which is today Sweden, to measure it near the poles. And of course, this is what the La Condamine, who then went on to discover the Amazon, as it were, he began. He's the one who actually conducted this triangulation. But this is what a triangulation was. There's a baseline at Quito and a baseline at Cuerda, I think, down south, across the Andes. And across the Andes, they found, it's over 300 miles, measured basically the distance between this and this. And with celestial measurements, they knew the angle, basically, that this thing of the celestial arc. And so accordingly, they could actually measure the Earth, the length of a degree, the length of a degree of latitude. And based on this, they discovered, of course, that the Earth was flat at the poles, because the team at Lapland found the length of a degree much more than the length of the degree at the equator. But then when we come to Bangalore, William Lambton makes a proposal to Lord Wellesley, at that time, Richard Wellesley, the Governor General at the time, to ask for permission to do a triangulation of the peninsula of India. Now that Tipu was rid of, the land was free to actually do measurements of this sort. Interestingly, he never told Richard Wellesley that he wanted to measure the curvature of the Earth. What he said is that I will mark the boundaries with more precision on a curved surface, on the accurate surface of the Earth, than any other surveyor can do. So it became a mathematical enterprise. And with this began the great trigonometric survey of India. But it began with a measurement of a baseline in Bangalore. that ran across from the village of Banaswadi down to ASC Center across the Belandur, the airport, the present airport today. He used this as a starting point to measure the width of the peninsula. There were certain happenings, which we will get into in a short while, that actually disrupted the accuracy of his measure, and he began again in Madras 2 years later. But in 1800, this is what he triangulated in this thing, and then came back and verified it again. Over here in 1806, he began the great arc of the meridian, measuring the Earth's curvature from 8 degrees latitude, Cape Comorin, up to the Himalayas, which was finally reached in 1840. But it was Bangalore where he began to go south. Then he came back here and then went north, along what is called the Dodaganta meridian, which he wanted to see as the equivalent of the Greenwich meridian. And Dodaganta is this place, is a little village north of Alsutang. This ultimately in the 1890s is what materialized from what he began over here. So this is the work of a century, where India was triangulated and Bangalore was centered with mathematical precision, as it were, on the peninsula of India. Now, as much as it extended out, this triangulation came back to map Bangalore accurately, and you see the Peta and the cantonment. This is an 1854 map of Bangalore that was derived from the trigonometric survey. So very different from the route survey. As much as the route surveyor was working, so almost inductively working with measurements that extended from a point, here you had the curvature of the Earth decided, and then you came down to Bangalore. And this is where it began.
I will interrupt there. Partly because of time, and so that we can get to even the rest of the lecture. But in some ways, I'm interrupting him just as Lambton was interrupted when he was measuring the baseline. And he writes actually that 2/3 of the way, the arm of a great tank, because it was the wet season, actually came in the way of his measurement. And he was actually forced to stop his triangulation and actually measure again in the next season. And what he actually discovered was the Belandur tank. And so now just to position this sort of mathematical measurement of these lines and points which were part of a landscape, Lambton by accident, because he was really not that familiar with this land, came across another line which had a power in this landscape. And what you're really seeing here is the measurement. And this is where he was interrupted because it was the wet season, the tank filled up. And it was another powerful line in the landscape which started to exert its own measure and started to defy actually these fixed points. Next. And though the slide is very light, we're really talking about a line which is not as geometric, but is the line of a band. And the tanks in this landscape, as Mrs. Bowring, who was actually taking a carriage ride, said that the sugarcane and the rice looks most flourishing in the wet land under the tanks, which have all the appearance of natural lakes. Many of these have been constructed most skillfully. So the engineering of the tank pertains as much to the positioning of a band. So it's a very different kind of line, but it actually has the power to gather a wide landscape. And so we find that while this kind of mathematical measurement was taking, there were other measures of the land which were emerging. And this is, of course, a photographic work, more recent one, about this ephemeral line which actually gathers water, but it also gathers settlement. I mean, Bandh really is about an infrastructure line, whether it's about transportation, roads, settlements. And it also gathers soil. And looking at the map of Bangalore today, it's more a collapse of the many tanks which were here. It's really a gathering of bands which actually became the first infrastructure of settlement. Next. And the band, as many of you, this is actually a band on the east of Bangalore of a famous tank called Ramsagar tank. And whether it's calculated or intuitive, it really is strung across the land of an undulating land. And if you make a perfectly straight line, it would impound water. But what is really fascinating is that, as a surveyor, or even today as engineers or water engineers or people interested in issues of ecology, we still tend to see these tanks as fields of water. So what you're really looking at here is the typical image. But most of the year, what is really existing is this. It's a land of bands. And this particular territory is called the land of 1,000 tanks, with Ramsagar tank really being the 1,000th tank. There's a plaque actually there which says so. But also what's very interesting that it is really a land which is as much about brick making, it's about laterite. In fact, all the soil which has actually come here is the erosion of actually the sedimentary rock over here, which is laterite, and it's a kind of a disease. And that actually comes and settles in these tanks, And so we are really interested as designers that this is really a constructed landscape, and the Bandh is a strategic way of thinking about design. Next. And unlike, we're used to studying about river civilizations, and there are no rivers in Bangalore, and you wonder, are we a great civilization? But really, it's a civilization of overflows rather than flows. And this is, just a diagram about how from Ramsagar, there are many, many ways, water could come down or be gathered. And so rather than being a hierarchical system or even, a linear system, it really is a labyrinth. And this is just to explain that there are many, many routes one drop of water can take in this landscape. Next. But for us, the challenge of how do we think about it and how do we draw and bring out these issues. And so for a moment, we just looked at the tanks of Bangalore and the festival of the Ganpati, when from a dry tank bed, the Ganpati is made, even though it's a very recent event in a place like Bangalore. It goes through the whole city and is dunked when the wet season back in the lake. And so what it really opens is a rhythmic, it's a temporal occupation. And when you think about lakes, you think about perennial water bodies as something which is natural. So it's really something which moves from wet to dry. And so it's not that surprising to see a dry tank bed, which would be horrifying if you saw a dry lake. And next. And it's interestingly, this is a very recent postcard which we picked up from the Forest Department notice board. And this is the image we carry with us, actually, that we do think about it. This is an image from Switzerland. And it's a very different thing if you start to talk about, represent it as a temporal occupation. And it's interesting because I want to also use this postcard to enter into another sort of enterprise which was taking place on the tableland around the time Dilip was talking about, which was the advent of picturesque art and a way of recording the landscape which was probably fairly new, about actually seeing things and picturing them, but also being able to assemble things in different ways, whether it was true or not. And this is probably one of the few images in which there is a sort of, fantasy. You can see Taj Mahal, Trichanaguru Temple, and other temples which have been put together. But we also find that, the picturesque art, which was developing in England, when it came to India, it acquired a whole other form. It actually became a way of documenting the land. It was less about the playfulness of the artist. And this is one of these unusual paintings. Yeah, but I'll let Dilip sort of...
This is a painting by Thomas Daniels, done in 1799, after he returned from India. Returned to England in 1792, but after spending 7 years traveling through various parts of India, and you can see the travels over here. And he was asked by Thomas Hope to produce a drawing of the landscape of India, and this is what he did. And you see over here, it's Ajanta and Ellora. You can see in the background over there. This is the Trichanaguru temple Kailasanatha temple on the South Pennar, and Bangalore is represented here with the Gavi Gangadeshwara temple, which you see them. They were here on May 1st of 1792 and painted these various objects on the hill, in Gavipuram. I'm not sure what that means. we can't remember Thomas Daniels anymore. But one of the things that we were quite fascinated by, actually, in this particular landscape south of Bangalore, I don't know if you all are familiar with this particular hill, actually, that this particular mantap still exists. And interestingly enough, it is not included among the 4 Kempegowda towers. It dates to the same, it shows the same characteristics. But if you know the myth of the 4 Kempegowda towers, it is said that Kempegowda II built 4 towers to in some way mark the limits of the city that he envisioned. And you find one here in Palace Orchards, another one in Kempambudi Tank, one on Lalbagh Rock, and the 4th on Alsur Tank Rock, the rock adjacent to Alsur Tank. But this one seems to have been excluded for some reason. And interestingly enough, it was the only one that was. These are the 4 positions of the towers of Kempegowda, which is also supposed to mark the cardinal points of Bangalore. Although when you position them in a map, it's very difficult to find a common center. But this particular mantap, which we call the 5th mantap, was painted again and again by various artists at the time. They did not paint any of the other Kempegowda towers, but they painted this one. And interestingly, it was, a search for objects in the landscape that drew their attention. And as Anu said, they were searching for representing the truth. This has become the language of archaeology. It's become the language of architecture. We present scenarios today. I mean, in Photoshop, if you know the tool, is a great facility to actually put together scenes from various landscapes in order to portray a future that you want the client to visualize, or you want the student to visualize. So even historians were indulging in this particular art of visualizing the object. Botany adopted it, and various other sciences as well, in order to picture trees. Some more of these. I mean, there are a whole lot of them, actually, interestingly. But what we found...
What is actually interesting was that while the picturesque artists were really interested in a frontal view about actually presenting it out there, we were sort of curious, and it's more a speculation, but it opens a much larger question about landscaper. There are these two steps which are sort of dug out into the rock on which this mandap stood, this fifth mandap. And so it opened the whole idea that, these objects or these things were in the landscape not really to be seen at a distance, but to be engaged, to be circumscribed. So it was a much more an idea of a bodily engagement. And next. And we also found one sketch by the Daniels, which never really became a painting of the bull temple with the Nandi. In some ways, he was too close to the figure of the bull to actually make a distant view. And this, more than anything else, sort of opened up that while certain things were chosen, but it gave us an avenue to start to explore the contemporary landscape, or the landscape which was in parallel being actually engaged simultaneously. So we actually looked at the whole notion of circumscribing, of actually, moving around places, or actually moving through landscape as a way of understanding its presence and its materiality. Interestingly enough, this particular temple, actually there is a myth. This is where the bull temple is. If you look at on a much larger regional scale, and Bangalore is here, and this is the Kaveri River, that actually the source of the Vishwa Bharati, which finally drains into the Kaveri, was at the foot of the Nandi bull. And
it actually sets up an interesting trajectory, actually, that we then traced in the land. The Vishwa Bharati, apparently, if it starts in the bull temple, flows down here, as Anu said, to Sangam. But what happened in the 1970s, when Bangalore started to draw water from the Kaveri, you had a pipeline that came from the Shiv Samudram Anicut or weir that flowed and was pumped up the 70 kilometers to Bangalore, to high ground in Bangalore. Much of this water flows to the west and then returns via the Vishwa Bharati to the... It's an interesting landscape that we call the fourth island. Fourth island, meaning after the three islands already in the Kaveri, the Adiranga, Madhyaranga, and Antyaranga, which is really Srirangapatnam, Shivsamudram, and Srirangam. They are the places of Lord Ranganatha, and protected islands in the Kaveri. And so they have the three islands. And now you have, we were there last year actually at Shivsamudram, and the falls, it was just a flow of rock. Basically the Kaveri was dry, and much of the...
Or being sucked to Bangalore. Yeah?
Pardon?
Or being taken to Bangalore.
Yes, much of the water. This is how James Fraser saw the Shivsamudram Falls in 1810, and this is what many people go to see. They go to see the picturesque. They go to see the picture, as it were, of the water. They don't go to see the water that is being siphoned out, as it were, of the Kaveri to feed Bangalore. But the interesting thing about Shivsamudram is that it is a juncture. It's a transition in the Kaveri from a Kaveri that flows through on a flat plateau to a land of gorges, which is very interestingly different from the way rivers usually flow. They flow from what you call young rivers to old meandering rivers in alluvial plains. Kaveri, for a moment, reverses itself from a old river to a young river here. It's born again, as it were, in Shivsamudram, across the Shivsamudram falls. And you can see, when you look at the sections of the Kaveri, the flatness of the Mysore tableland and the gorges of the Biligiri Rangan hills. And it's a little too difficult to read these pictures, I think, from this, where you're sitting. But this is the Kaveri, the two sides of the Shivsamudram Falls, and the various landscapes that it goes through. But it's a transitioning landscape, and that's what's important. We looked at both sides. We looked at the landscape of sand on the one hand, and that is the region of Talakad.
Yes, and the whole idea of circumscribing actually made us find a way to actually understand a particular ritual which has been emerged in this landscape. And a lot of these temples over there have actually been completely submerged due to the erosion and deposition of the river. And Talakad is really on this particular bend, which is an unusual bend. There are very few real meanders on the Kaveri. And just so that we can get to the end of the lecture, I won't go into the details, but we found that this particular ritual in which people came to 5 temples but were asked to go to different directions of the Kaveri, to go to the east flowing, west flowing, north flowing, south flowing, was a way to embody the idea of a meander within a particular ritual. And it's a different way of thinking about circumscribing and engaging this land. Next. And also the whole process of erosion and deposition, and today the tenacious gathering of sand. And of course there are trucks which sit in the Kaveri and in other places which are completely causing a different problem. But there are also these men who are in these little iron boats who actually have a very tenacious existence of actually just of their balance of weight. And they actually open up a whole other rhythm to how that landscape is eroded and deposited. Next. And also, this is our own ride down the Coracle, which is a round boat. And, Domingo Paes, a Portuguese traveler, had actually thought that it was a nonsensical boat which went nowhere. And what's fascinating is it's a whole other way of negotiating the rapids of the Kaveri. Most people in Western countries will go whitewater rafting and attack the rapids. But it's a very different movement if you take a round boat and actually go this way, that way, and start to actually find your way. So what actually we are trying to do in this presentation is rush through, 3 or 4 years of work in a very extensive exhibition. But in all these landscapes or these, artistic, scientific projects we find there's something which eludes this fixing. There's something which opens up the landscape into a more dynamic entity. And so in each one of these enterprises, we are trying to actually recover that, while understanding the measures we've received in terms of our education, administration. And I think the last of these enterprises
the last of these enterprises is botanizing. The whole the movement of plants across the world, and Bangalore was very much in the path of this particular enterprise. This was a time when Joseph Banks was sitting in London, orchestrating the movement of plants for economic gain. He in league with King George III, who was also called Farmer George. They took over Kew Gardens in London and made that the central garden of the world. Plants would come from across the world to Kew and go places from Kew. So this is difficult to read, but this is actually a charting of the movement of plants in and out of Joseph Banks' Soho apartment and Kew Gardens. But the ship was the quintessential botanical garden of this particular time, because it took months to travel across the oceans, and there was a whole sophistication to the science of plant collection and carriage that then entered botanical gardens. So I just quickly come to Bangalore, when Lord Wellesley actually in 1799 ordered Benjamin Hayne, a naturalist and one of the Tranquebar botanists, sort of missionary come doctor, working with the East India Company, to take over the Sultan's Garden in Bangalore. And that's the Sultan's Garden in Bangalore, which eventually evolved into Lal Bagh. Now the Sultan and Hyder Ali before him had already begun sort of experimental collection of plants, particularly mulberry, custard apples, peaches, things like that, plants from Mauritius, Persia, the cypress, etc. They were also called cypress gardens. But Lord Wellesley asked Benjamin Hayne to take over this garden and make it into a botanical garden, a depot for the plants of the country. Robert Clive, the governor in Madras, gave Benjamin Hayne a different instruction, told him, you go there and make it a garden that will supply food to the troops. So he made it both a horticultural enterprise and a botanical enterprise, and his plan is well documented. This is how artists documented Lal Bagh at the time, in 1791, actually before Benjamin Hayne, 1791-92, and you see the cypress gardens over there. with the Bangalore fort. This is taken from the Lal Bagh Rock area, if you're familiar, from the east of Bangalore. But Bangalore evolved into a garden of some presence on the tableland. But interestingly enough, by 1857, Hugh Cleghorn, a forester with the Madras government, was asked by the government to identify a third garden besides Madras, the gardens of Madras and Ooty, to acclimatize plants from across the world. Now, this was not a new idea. Bangalore was on this map before, but somehow Lal Bagh had fallen off the map, and in some sense, the city was already, to some extent, a garden city. When Hugh Cleghorn was asked to do this, he came here, he could not identify a garden with precision. He eventually found Lal Bagh, but, and chose Lal Bagh to be this third garden. You see, it was ultimately tropical Madras, alpine Ooty, temperate Bangalore. Plants from Europe would come here, go down to Bangalore, go down to Madras over a period of time. It is a process of acclimatizing, and then vice versa too. This change of the shift from longitude and latitude to altitude was a very interesting one. It gives a different measure to the tableland. Bangalore is a mediating landscape now on an altitude wise. It's not, and interestingly, it was mediating between the tropics and the temperate. The soldiers had always said, when they come to Bangalore, it is like coming to the Mediterranean. They use the word Levant. It was like coming to the Levant, And then from here, if they moved up, it was going further north into Europe. So when climbing Nandi, for example, Nandi was approaching England. Ahuja spoke of, but almost all the plants in Bangalore are introduced. This land, as our exhibition suggests, was a naked country. It was referred to a naked country by a number of travelers for various reasons. Perhaps it was because of the war. I mean, everything was eaten, or because it was intrinsically just a land of gardens without high canopy trees. But most of the trees that you see, the rain tree came in the 1870s. Rain tree that most people associate with the garden city of Bangalore. But this was a planting of the streets of Bangalore according to flowers, allowing each street to have one flower in bloom at any time of the year. There was also a botanical enterprise which we can't forget Lal Bagh was involved in, and that was the drawing of plants that continued well into the 1890s. And K.C. Raju's work is world famous to some extent. And here you see the plumeria, another introduced species which we call the temple tree. The glass house, the Lal Bagh glass house was built in 1889, and interestingly, it was built for the flower shows because the whole idea of botanizing did not rest with just bringing in plants. It was also instigating competition to improve species, improve hybridization, and change, the sort of nature of plants. Beautification was perhaps one of the main drives, but there was also utility. I mean, the potatoes that came in first to Nandi in the 1800s were like small pebbles, and they ended up in 20 years becoming big marbles, one would say. But this was modeled on the ground of Crystal Palace, and many people make a formal association with Crystal Palace. But the thing about the glass house is that it is actually economically in the same ballpark as the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was built in 1851 as a structure of glass, but it was to foster global competition. It was to perfect technology. And so here you had the so-called best of the world exhibited for the first time in 1851. But it was a spirit of competition. And Lal Bagh Glass House has to some extent imbibed that aspect of Crystal Palace as a place of demonstrating. So flower shows are not just shows. They're competitive events. The glass house is often compared to the Crystal Palace also because there's a certain transparency. It was called crystal because there was no distinction between the interior and the exterior. And from here, you find plants that have gone through the flower shows across the tableland to various parts across the peninsula as well, and transformed economies, cuisines, and sceneries of the peninsula.
And it is also, we won't develop it in this particular lecture, but even Nandi sort of become very much part of the world of Lal Bagh, where the different sort of altitudes or heights, even though it's not a very high hill station as hill stations go in India, but there was this large connection of actually cultivating the larger territory. Next. And, you know, in its own structure, it's actually very peculiar how it actually defines this larger geology and topography. But it was really omnipresent, and around it was centered a whole enterprise of agriculture and cultivation and silk rearing, which still exists today. But what is interesting to us is that there is another presence of flowers in Bangalore today, that they have two lives. It's not only in the gardens and roses that we admire. Flowers are really grown here in fields, and they have one life in the field. And the second life is really after they are cut. Next. And they're really brought in by weight, and the rhythm is to do with the rhythm of festivals, the rhythm of occasions and weddings. And this kind of flowers are actually very, very present. I mean, when you think about it, this is just a diagram of this is City Market over here, and how the flowers come to City Market and move through all the markets in the city, whether by trucks, whether by cars and lorries, or just in women's hair. Next. And this is an image of actually City Market. And this is very much as present a landscape and as ephemeral and as difficult to capture in formal terms versus actually the garden or the charbagh. Next.
So finally, when we see this title, the Garden City, Bangalore the Garden City, or the Bangalore the Garden City of India, what we see beyond it is in some ways a naked country that was made the Garden City. This is a constructed landscape, and the larger agenda, to some extent, is to draw attention to the fact that it can be constructed again and again and again through acts of settlement. And acts of settlement, I draw attention to again the first act of settlement, whereby we set up imaginatively a language for future development, rather than remain with a language of surveying, triangulating, botanizing, and picturing that has been with us for the last 200 years and given us the institutions that we, to some extent, live with today. Nobody wants to traverse anymore. We feel we've got the institutions that, if at all, there's a thing. It's a frontier that is very much within a disciplinary field. The crossing of disciplinary boundaries is something that is perhaps emerging today with the dissatisfaction of the problems that are facing the city today. And you can't look for solutions in the same language that gave the problems in the first place. And so it sort of leads us to actually develop further this first act of settlement as perhaps a culture that a city could imbibe.
And so in some ways what we are really doing in our larger work, in our book, in the exhibition, is to, at one hand, look at this historical point in 1790s. And the purpose is not to necessarily critique it or to reject it, but just to acknowledge its existence. So we have some sense of where this language today we use comes from. Now, whether we want to continue the language, we may appreciate it and go forward, or we decide that there is time to deflect and change. We feel it's a very critical moment in sort of the life of Bangalore. And on the other hand, we find, just as travelers ourselves, there is this wonderful rich material beneath our feet, whether it's the soil of Bangalore, it's this common rock which we see as chapti on the walls, which lines every pavement drain, which is a true monument here, actually. It's 3 billion years old. And more than the mandap up there, this peninsular gneiss, as it's known as, is the monument on which the city rests. So we feel we are at this moment in history in Bangalore where it's need to look at the representations we've constructed, to look at the moment we are in order to know which way we actually go forward. And we've attempted to take some of our own journeys, but take these 4 historical points. There may be many others, so it's not as much about that these are the only trajectories which happened on this tableland, but to play with them and to bring imagination back into the way we see and appreciate landscape.